Dr. Stephen Clark had not slept in 3 days and his eyes burned from staring at computer screens, but he could not stop working. His laboratory had become the center of humanity's last hope, and every hour brought them closer to the impossible battle ahead. The data streams from deep space monitors filled dozens of screens around him, and each new piece of information about the Kethanari fleet made their situation look worse. Dr. Amanda Foster worked beside him analyzing quantum field readings from the approaching ships. She was the best physicist on Earth and her specialty was energy manipulation, but even she struggled to understand what they were seeing. The Kethanari vessels generated power signatures that defied known science. Their shields operated on principles that human technology could barely detect, much less replicate or counter. Dr. Kevin Martinez joined them in the laboratory carrying fresh coffee and grim news from the orbital defenses. His background was in weapons design and he had spent the last week trying to find some way to hurt the approaching fleet. Every simulation ended the same way, with human weapons having no effect on Kethanari shields. The enemy armor was too strong, and their defensive systems too advanced for anything humanity could build. Stephen stared at the main display, which showed the enemy fleet's approach pattern in 3 dimensions. Something about their formation bothered him, but he could not identify what it was. The ships moved in perfect geometric patterns that never varied, and their spacing remained constant, despite the vast distances involved. It was like watching a machine rather than a living military force, and that gave him an idea. Amanda noticed his change in expression and asked what he was thinking. Stephen pointed to the communication logs that showed how the Kethanari ships coordinated their movements. Every vessel in the fleet remained in constant contact through quantum entanglement networks that operated faster than light. The system allowed perfect coordination across impossible distances, but it also created a potential weakness that no one had considered before. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Jackson arrived at the laboratory with a team of engineers who specialized in fusion reactor design. Stephen had requested their help for something he called the Prometheus Protocol, but he had not explained what it involved. Paul was a practical man who built things that worked under extreme conditions, and he wanted to know exactly what the scientist had in mind. Stephen explained his theory while Amanda pulled up technical diagrams on the main screen. The Kethanari fleet's greatest strength was also its potential weakness. Their quantum communication system allowed perfect coordination, but it also meant that disrupting those communications could throw their entire force into chaos. The problem was finding a way to interfere with quantum entanglement on such a massive scale. Kevin studied the energy requirements and shook his head. The amount of power needed to disrupt quantum fields across interstellar distances was enormous. Earth's entire power grid could not generate enough energy for such an attempt, and they had less than 4 days to implement any plan they developed. The physics were possible, but the engineering seemed impossible. Paul listened to the discussion and then asked a question that changed everything. What if they did not try to generate the power from Earth's grid, but instead used every fusion reactor in human space simultaneously? The combined energy release from hundreds of reactors might be enough to create the electromagnetic cascade they needed. It would mean sacrificing every power source humanity possessed, but it might give them one chance to level the playing field. Meanwhile, Captain Maria Santos monitored the approaching fleet from Deep Space Station Watchtower 7. Her position at the edge of the solar system gave her the best view of enemy movements, and what she observed troubled her. The Kethanari ships followed predetermined flight paths with mathematical precision, and they never deviated from their course even when space debris or asteroid fields blocked their way. Instead, they simply destroyed anything in their path and continued forward. Maria reported her observations to the Defense Command, and her analysis added another piece to Stephen's growing understanding. The enemy fleet showed no creativity or adaptation in their approach. Every movement followed patterns that could be predicted with computer precision. They were facing an enemy that relied entirely on overwhelming force rather than tactical flexibility. Commander Alex Thompson worked in the Tactical Simulation Center running battle scenarios around the clock. His computers had processed thousands of possible engagements, and every single one ended with humanity's complete destruction within hours. The Kethanari weapons were too powerful and their defenses too strong for conventional warfare to succeed. But Alex began to notice something interesting in the enemy response patterns. When the simulations showed human forces acting unpredictably, the Kethnari responses became less efficient. Their tactical doctrine was built around fighting enemies, who followed standard military principles. They had never faced an opponent who fought with desperate creativity, rather than established strategy. This observation gave Alex an idea that he immediately shared with Admiral Morrison. Colonel Jennifer Mills coordinated with resistance cells across Earth, preparing for the possibility that the orbital battle would be lost. Her teams developed plans for guerrilla warfare that could continue for decades if necessary. The underground shelters being built across the planet would serve as bases for a resistance movement that would make the Kethnari pay for every day they occupied Earth. Jennifer's work revealed something important about human nature that the aliens clearly did not understand. Humans became more dangerous when they were desperate, not less. The worse their situation became, the more creative and determined their resistance grew. This was a psychological factor that no computer simulation could properly calculate, and it might be the key to surprising their enemies. Back in the laboratory, Stephen's team worked frantically to design the technical components of the Prometheus protocol. Amanda calculated the precise timing needed to synchronize fusion reactor overloads across dozens of worlds. Kevin designed the triggering mechanisms that would allow simultaneous detonation despite the vast distances involved. Paul's engineers built the actual devices that would turn every human reactor into a weapon. The plan was insane by any reasonable standard. They would be destroying humanity's entire energy infrastructure for one desperate gamble that might not even work. If the electromagnetic pulse failed to disrupt Kethnari communications, then Earth would be left defenseless and powerless. But Stephen knew they had no choice because conventional warfare offered no hope at all. Admiral Morrison visited the laboratory to review their progress, and his presence reminded everyone what was at stake. The man who would lead humanity's last battle needed to understand exactly what his scientists were attempting. Stephen explained the theory behind quantum field disruption, while Amanda showed him the power calculations. The Admiral listened carefully and then gave his approval for the most desperate plan in human history. The final day of preparation arrived with news that the Kethnari fleet had reached the outer planets. Their ships passed Jupiter without slowing, and their energy signatures grew stronger with each passing hour. Long-range sensors detected weapon systems powering up and shield generators reaching full strength. The enemy was preparing for battle, and they showed no signs of doubt or hesitation. Stephen made final adjustments to the Prometheus protocol, while his team completed installation of the triggering devices. They had built something that had never been attempted before, and they would only get one chance to test it under actual combat conditions. The success or failure of their plan would determine whether humanity survived as a free species or joined the billions of slaves serving the Kethnari Empire. As the enemy fleet approached the inner solar system, Stephen realized that they had accomplished something remarkable. In less than a week, they had developed technology that pushed the boundaries of human science. They had created a weapon from desperation and determination. Whether it would be enough to save Earth remained to be seen, but they had proven that humans could achieve the impossible when their survival was at stake. The Kethnari fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system, like a wall of death moving through the darkness. 500 massive ships materialized in perfect formation, and their combined energy signatures lit up every sensor array that humanity possessed. Each vessel was a monument to destructive power, and together they represented the military might of an empire that had never known defeat. War Master Zethkai stood on the bridge of his flagship and surveyed the primitive system that would soon belong to the hegemony. His species had conquered 17 star systems and enslaved dozens of worlds, but this campaign felt different. The humans had refused his offer of surrender, and their defiance puzzled him. Every other species had submitted when faced with the Invincible fleet, but these creatures seemed determined to fight despite the obvious futility of resistance. Admiral Jake Morrison received the enemy ultimatum while standing on the bridge of the USS Defiance. The message was broadcast on all frequencies and translated into every human language. Zethakai's voice carried the authority of absolute power, and his words were simple and final. Humanity had 6 hours to surrender unconditionally or face complete annihilation. There would be no negotiation and no mercy for those who chose to resist. Jake's response was broadcast throughout human space, and his words would be remembered for generations. He looked directly into the camera and spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who had already made peace with death. The Admiral told the War Master that if he wanted Earth, he would have to come and take it. Humanity would not kneel to any master, and they would make the Kethnari pay for every inch of ground they claimed. The human fleet moved into position between Earth and the approaching armada. 89 ships against 500 represented odds that would have been hopeless in any conventional battle. Captain Rachel Davis commanded the carrier USS Freedom, and her flight decks were busy launching every fighter that humanity could field. Her pilots knew they were flying toward certain death, but they sang old Earth songs as their ships left the launch bays. Squadron leader Chris Evans led the first wave of fighters, and his voice came over the communication channels calm and steady. He had flown in dozens of battles, but never against an enemy like this. The Kethnari ships were so large that his entire squadron could have landed inside one of their weapon ports. But Chris and his pilots had volunteered for this mission because someone had to make the first strike against the invaders. Dr. Stephen Clark made final preparations for the Prometheus protocol from his laboratory deep beneath Earth's surface. Every fusion reactor in human space was now connected to his triggering system, and the electromagnetic pulse generators were charged and ready. He had one chance to disrupt the enemy communication network, and the timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the effect would wear off before it could be exploited. Too late, and there would be no human fleet left to take advantage of the chaos. Dr. Amanda Foster monitored quantum field fluctuations as the Kethnari fleet moved closer to engagement range. The enemy ships generated energy patterns that defied human understanding, but her instruments could detect the quantum entanglement signatures that connected their vessels. When Stephen activated the Prometheus protocol, those connections would be severed for exactly 17 minutes before the Kethnari systems could compensate and restore communication. The first shots of the battle came from Kethnari long-range weapons, and they lit up space with energies that could be seen from Earth's surface. Human ships exploded in seconds under the alien barrage, and their shields offered no protection against weapons that manipulated space and time itself. The USS Challenger vanished in a flash of brilliant light that left no debris behind. The destroyer Yorktown lasted long enough to return fire before enemy beams tore it apart. Captain Danny Walsh commanded his reconnaissance ship in a desperate charge toward the center of the enemy formation. His vessel was faster than the larger human warships, and he needed to get close enough to confirm Dr. Clark's theories about Kethnari communication systems. Danny knew his ship would not survive the attempt, but the data he gathered might give humanity its only chance for victory. The human fighters reached the Kethnari fleet first, and Squadron Leader Evans led his pilots in an attack that would be remembered as one of the bravest actions in military history. Their weapons could barely scratch the enemy shields, but they flew directly at ships the size of cities and fired everything they had. One by one, the fighters were destroyed by defensive systems that swatted them aside like insects, but they had served their purpose by drawing enemy attention away from the larger ships. Lieutenant Commander Nick Johnson aboard the destroyer USS Reliance led a dozen human warships in a suicidal charge directly at the Kethnari center formation. His ships were hopelessly outgunned, but they needed to get close enough for detailed scans of the enemy command vessels. Nick's destroyer was among the first to die, but not before transmitting critical targeting data back to Dr. Clark's laboratory. As human ships fell one by one, something unexpected began to happen. The Kethnari fleet slowed its advance, and their perfect formation showed signs of confusion. War Master Zethkai had never encountered an enemy that continued fighting when victory was clearly impossible. His tactical computers could not calculate the probability of success for forces that refused to surrender when defeat was certain. The alien commander studied the human battle patterns and found them incomprehensible. These creatures threw away their lives with no hope of achieving military objectives. Their ships attacked targets they could not possibly destroy, and their fighters flew into certain death without hesitation. It was not warfare as the Kethnari understood it, but something else entirely. Admiral Morrison watched his fleet being systematically destroyed, but he felt a strange sense of pride. His ships were dying, but they were dying well, and their sacrifice was not in vain. Every human vessel that fell took sensor readings and transmitted data that Dr. Clark needed for his plan. The Prometheus Protocol required precise information about enemy ship positions, and the brave crews of the human fleet were providing that intelligence with their lives. Captain Davis found herself commanding one of the few surviving human ships as the battle entered its most desperate phase. The USS Freedom had lost most of her fighters, but her remaining pilots continued to harass the enemy fleet. Captain Evans was among the few survivors, and his damaged fighter barely held together as he made one final attack run against a Kethnari dreadnought. Dr. Clark watched the battle through the data streams flowing into his laboratory and waited for the perfect moment to activate his weapon. The Kethnari ships had moved into optimal positions, and their communication network was operating at maximum capacity. In 30 seconds, he would trigger every fusion reactor in human space and create an electromagnetic cascade that would either save humanity or guarantee their complete destruction. The moment arrived with the flash of another human ship dying under enemy fire. Dr. Clark's finger hovered over the activation switch as Amanda confirmed that all systems were ready. The fate of humanity rested on a desperate gamble based on theoretical physics and powered by the sacrifice of an entire civilization's energy infrastructure. Stephen took a deep breath and activated the Prometheus Protocol. The electromagnetic pulse spread outward from thousands of detonating fusion reactors faster than light itself. The wave of energy washed over the Kethnari fleet like an invisible tsunami, and for 17 minutes the most powerful military force in the galaxy was reduced to 500 individual ships without central coordination. The Invincible fleet had just experienced something they thought was impossible. They had been hurt by an enemy they should have crushed without effort. The electromagnetic cascade from the Prometheus Protocol hit the Kethnari fleet like an invisible hammer, and for the first time in their military history, the Invincible fleet experienced chaos. Quantum communication links that had operated flawlessly for centuries suddenly went silent, and 500 massive warships found themselves isolated in the darkness of space. Ship commanders who had never made an independent decision waited for orders that would not come. Admiral Jake Morrison felt the change immediately, even though he could not see it. The Kethnari formation, which had moved with mechanical precision, suddenly became ragged and uncertain. Ships that had coordinated their movements across vast distances now drifted without central guidance. The electromagnetic pulse had bought humanity exactly 17 minutes of opportunity, and Morrison was determined not to waste a single second. Captain Rachel Davis commanded the USS Freedom and found herself leading the remnants of humanity's fleet in their most desperate hour. Her carrier was heavily damaged and most of her fighters were gone, but she still had weapons and a crew willing to use them. The Kethnari ships around her seemed confused and hesitant without their communication network, and she knew this might be humanity's only chance to strike back. Squadron leader Chris Evans piloted one of the few surviving fighters, and his voice crackled over the radio as he called for all remaining human ships to follow him. His fighter was barely holding together, and his weapons were nearly depleted, but he had spotted something that changed everything. One of the Kethnari command ships was showing signs of shield fluctuation, and it might be vulnerable to concentrated attack. Dr. Stephen Clark monitored the battle from his laboratory and watched his plan unfold with a mixture of hope and terror. The electromagnetic pulse had worked exactly as predicted, but the window of opportunity was closing fast. His instruments showed the Kethnari quantum systems beginning to adapt and compensate for the interference. In less than 15 minutes, their communication network would be restored, and the moment would be lost forever. The human ships that survived the initial assault regrouped around Admiral Morrison's flagship and prepared for what might be their final attack. The USS Defiance was scarred and battered, but her weapons still functioned and her crew was ready to follow their admiral into whatever came next. Morrison gave the order that would either save humanity or ensure their destruction with honor, intact. Lieutenant Sarah Park flew her damaged fighter through the Kethnari defensive perimeter and found herself facing the massive hull of an enemy dreadnought. Her weapons were no match for the alien armor, but the ship's shields were flickering and unstable without central coordination. Sarah armed her remaining missiles and dove toward the enemy vessel, knowing she would not survive the impact. The explosion, when her fighter struck the Kethnari hull, was small compared to the massive ship, but it had an effect that no one expected. The electromagnetic interference from the Prometheus protocol had made the enemy shields unstable, and Sarah's sacrifice created a cascade failure that spread across the entire vessel. For the first time in their history, a major Kethnari warship died in battle. Commander Alex Thompson watched the destruction of the enemy dreadnought from Earth's command center and realized that humanity had achieved something impossible. The Invincible fleet was no longer invincible, and their aura of unstoppable power was broken. More importantly, the psychological impact on the remaining Kethnari ships was immediate and devastating. Crews that had never known defeat suddenly faced the reality of their own mortality. War Master Zethkai stood on his flagship bridge and tried to understand what was happening to his perfect fleet. Individual ship commanders were making decisions without orders, and their coordination was falling apart. Some vessels continued their attack patterns while others hesitated or retreated to defensive positions. The humans had done something that seemed impossible, and turned the Invincible fleet into a collection of confused and frightened ships. Dr. Amanda Foster detected the first signs of system restoration in the Kethnari communication network and knew their time was running out. The quantum entanglement links were slowly re-establishing themselves as the alien technology adapted to the electromagnetic interference. But her sensors also showed something unexpected. The prolonged battle was causing instabilities in the Kethnari power systems that had never been designed for extended combat. Captain Davis led the surviving human ships in a coordinated attack on the damaged Kethnari vessels and found that several enemy ships were showing signs of power fluctuation. Their technology was incredibly advanced, but it was built for quick, overwhelming victories rather than sustained warfare. The electromagnetic pulse had forced them into an extended engagement, and their systems were beginning to fail under the strain. Chris Evans and the other surviving pilots formed up for one final attack run against the Kethnari flagship. Their fighters were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had proven that the enemy could be hurt. Evans armed his last torpedo and selected a target near what appeared to be the alien ship's main reactor. If he could cause enough damage, it might create a chain reaction that would cripple the massive vessel. The human fighter attack reached the Kethnari flagship just as their communication systems began to restore partial function. Enemy defensive. Weapons opened fire and destroyed most of the attacking fighters, but Chris Evans managed to penetrate their perimeter. His torpedo struck the alien hull and exploded in a shower of sparks that seemed insignificant compared to the massive ship, but the damage was more serious than it appeared. Dr. Clark watched his instruments as the Kethnari quantum network struggled to re-establish full coordination. The electromagnetic pulse was fading, but it had exposed fundamental weaknesses in alien technology that no one had suspected. Their ships were powerful, but they were also rigid and inflexible. When their perfect systems failed, they had no backup plans or alternative strategies. Admiral Morrison led the USS Defiance in a final charge toward the center of the enemy formation. His ship was dying around him and most of his fleet was already destroyed, but he had accomplished something that would change the course of the war. The Invincible fleet had been shown to be vulnerable, and word of that vulnerability would spread throughout the galaxy. Other enslaved species would learn that the Kethnari could be defeated. The battle reached its climax as the alien communication systems restored enough function for War Master Zethkai to regain partial control of his fleet. But the damage was already done both physically and psychologically. Several Kethnari ships had been destroyed or crippled, and the survivors were no longer the confident force that had entered the solar system. They had experienced something that challenged their fundamental understanding of warfare. Captain Davis found herself commanding the last functional human warship as the Prometheus protocol effect finally faded completely. The USS Freedom was alone against hundreds of enemy vessels, but she had witnessed something remarkable. The Kethnari ships were retreating from their original positions and forming defensive formations. The hunters had become the hunted, and they were afraid. Lieutenant Commander Nick Johnson had died with his ship earlier in the battle, But his sacrifice and that of countless others had provided the intelligence that made everything possible. The detailed scans of Kethnari technology revealed that their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. They depended entirely on central coordination and technological superiority. When those advantages were removed, they became vulnerable to an enemy that fought with desperate creativity. Warmaster Zethkai stared at the tactical display showing his damaged fleet and struggled to comprehend what had happened. His ships still outnumbered the humans by a massive margin, and their technology remained far superior. But something fundamental had changed in the last 17 minutes. The Invincible fleet had been bloodied by an enemy they should have crushed without effort, and that psychological wound would never fully heal. The communication channels between Kethnari ships filled with confusion and uncertainty as individual commanders reported damage and casualties. Some vessels had lost primary power systems while others suffered from computer malfunctions caused by the electromagnetic pulse. Most disturbing of all, several ships reported that their crews were experiencing something they had never known before. They were afraid, and that fear was spreading through the fleet like a virus. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the heavily damaged USS Defiance and made a decision that would echo through history. His ship was the last major human vessel still fighting, and conventional wisdom demanded that he retreat to Earth for a final defensive stand. Instead, he gave an order that defied all military logic and charged directly toward the Kethnari flagship. 7 smaller human ships followed him into what appeared to be a suicide attack. The surviving human pilots, including Chris Evans, formed up around the Admiral's ship for one last desperate assault. Their fighters were barely functional and their weapons were nearly depleted, but they flew with the determination of people who had already given everything for their cause. Chris armed his final torpedo and selected a target on the massive enemy command ship that loomed ahead like a mechanical mountain. Dr. Stephen Clark watched the final phase of the battle from his laboratory and realized that Admiral Morrison was buying time for something even more desperate than the Prometheus Protocol. The electromagnetic pulse had revealed critical data about Kethnari power systems, and Clark had discovered that their quantum network could be permanently damaged by introducing chaotic resonance patterns into their energy matrix. The cost would be enormous, but it might end the threat forever. Every remaining fusion reactor in human space would have to be detonated simultaneously to generate the massive energy wave required. Earth would be without power for months and millions of people might die in the resulting chaos. But the alternative was slavery for the entire human race, and Clark knew that Admiral Morrison was giving him the time needed to implement this final desperate gamble. Dr. Amanda Foster worked frantically to recalibrate the quantum field generators, while Dr. Kevin Martinez prepared the resonance cascade that would tear apart the Kethnari communication network permanently. They had perhaps 5 minutes before the Admiral's attack was crushed by the enemy fleet, and their last chance would be lost forever. The calculations were complex, and there would be no opportunity to test their theories before implementation. General Patricia Hayes coordinated the evacuation of Earth's population to the deepest underground shelters, while Colonel Jennifer Mills prepared her resistance cells for the aftermath. Even if the plan succeeded, Earth would be dark and powerless for months. Food distribution would collapse and medical systems would fail. The cure might be almost as deadly as the disease, but it was the only way to ensure that humanity remained free. Admiral Morrison's small force penetrated the Kethnari formation through sheer audacity and desperation. Enemy ships that should have destroyed them immediately seemed hesitant and confused. The psychological impact of seeing their fellow vessels destroyed had shaken the alien crews more than anyone expected. For the first time in their military history, the Kethnari were fighting an enemy that refused to acknowledge the impossibility of victory. Captain Rachel Davis followed the Admiral in the battered carrier USS Freedom with her few remaining fighters, providing cover. Her ship had no business being in the front line of an assault, but these were not normal circumstances. The human fleet had been reduced to a handful of vessels, but they flew with the fury of a species that would rather die free than live in chains. Warmaster Zethkai watched the human attack with growing confusion and something that might have been respect. These creatures fought with a determination that defied rational explanation. They continued attacking when any reasonable military force would have surrendered or retreated. Their ships were destroyed one by one, But the survivors kept coming, as if death meant nothing compared to the principle they defended. Commander Alex Thompson monitored the battle from Earth's command center and ran his final tactical analysis. The human attack was succeeding not because of superior strategy or technology, but because it was completely unpredictable. The Kethnari had never faced an enemy that operated on pure desperation, and their tactical computers could not calculate responses to actions that made no logical sense. Dr. Clark received the final confirmation he needed from the Admiral's assault force. The quantum resonance patterns in the Kethnari flagship matched his theoretical models perfectly. The alien technology was vulnerable to the type of cascade failure he had designed, and the chaotic energy wave from humanity's fusion reactors would be enough to trigger permanent system collapse throughout their fleet. The USS Defiance reached the Kethnari flagship, and Admiral Morrison gave his final order. His ship opened fire with everything it had left, while the remaining human fighters dove toward critical systems on the massive alien vessel. The enemy's defensive weapons responded immediately, and most of the attacking ships were destroyed in seconds. But they had accomplished their mission. They had provided the targeting data that Dr. Clark needed for his ultimate weapon. Chris Evans piloted his damaged fighter through the enemy defensive fire and reached his target on the Kethnari command ship. His final torpedo struck a critical junction in their quantum communication array, and the explosion sent feedback through their entire network. The damage was small, but it created the resonance pattern that would guide the coming energy wave to its target. Lieutenant Sarah Park's earlier sacrifice had proven that the enemy shields could fail, and now the surviving human pilots followed her example. One by one, they crashed their fighters into critical systems on the alien ships, knowing that each impact weakened the Kethnari network. Their deaths were not in vain because they were creating the conditions that would make Dr. Clark's plan possible. Dr. Clark activated the final phase of his weapon, and every fusion reactor in human space began its overload sequence. The energy release would be visible from neighboring star systems, and it would leave humanity powerless for months. But it would also generate a quantum cascade that would permanently destroy the Kethnari communication network and leave their ships isolated and vulnerable. The wave of chaotic energy struck the alien fleet like an invisible hurricane and tore through their quantum systems with devastating effect. Ships that had operated in perfect coordination for centuries suddenly found themselves cut off from all outside communication. Individual commanders who had never made independent decisions were forced to act without orders or guidance from their superiors. Admiral Morrison's ship was destroyed in the final moments of his attack, but he lived long enough to see the enemy formation begin to collapse. Kethnari vessels started colliding with each other as their coordination systems failed completely. Weapons fired randomly in all directions as damaged computers misidentified targets. The perfect military machine became a chaotic disaster that destroyed itself. War Master Zethkai stood on his flagship bridge and watched his invincible fleet tear itself apart. The humans had done something that seemed impossible and turned the galaxy's most powerful military force into a collection of isolated and confused ships. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage because it proved that the Kethnari were not the unstoppable force they believed themselves to be. The alien commander made a decision that shocked everyone, including his own crew. For the first time in the history of the Kethnari Empire, he ordered a retreat. The Invincible fleet would withdraw from human space and abandon their conquest of Earth. The cost of victory had become too high, and the psychological damage to his forces too severe to continue the campaign. Captain Davis found herself commanding the only human ship still capable of fighting as the Kethnari fleet began its withdrawal. The USS Freedom was barely functional, but she had survived the impossible battle and witnessed something that would change the galaxy forever. The Invincible fleet was retreating, and humanity had won through sheer determination and the willingness to sacrifice everything for freedom. The news of the Kethnari defeat spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, and the impact was immediate. Enslaved species on 17 worlds learned that their masters could be beaten, and rebellions erupted throughout the hegemony. The psychological foundation of the alien empire cracked as subject peoples realized that the Invincible fleet was neither invincible nor unstoppable. Earth lay in darkness with its power grid destroyed and millions facing hardship in the months ahead. Most of the human space fleet was gone and the planet's defenses were shattered. But humanity had achieved something that would be remembered for thousands of years. They had faced an enemy that could not be defeated, and defeated them anyway, through pure determination and the refusal to accept surrender. Admiral Morrison's final message was broadcast throughout human space and became the motto that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. He had told the Kethnari that they thought they were fighting human ships and weapons, but they had actually been fighting the human spirit, and that could never be conquered. Those words would inspire free peoples throughout the galaxy and remind them that freedom was always worth fighting for regardless of the odds. The Invincible fleet limped away from the solar system carrying scars that would never heal. They had come to conquer another weak species and instead encountered something they did not understand. Humanity had shown the galaxy that determination and the willingness to sacrifice could overcome any technological advantage. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance and watched the worst news of his life appear on the main screen. The message had come from deep space monitors 3 hours ago, and every word made his blood run cold. The Kethnari. Hegemony was coming to Earth, and they brought with them the most feared military force in the known galaxy. Commander Lisa Rodriguez walked up to him with a datapad in her hands. Her face was pale, and her usually steady voice shook as she spoke. The intelligence report she carried contained details that would change everything for humanity. The Kethnari. Fleet numbered 500 massive ships, and each one was the size of a small city. They called themselves the Invincible, and for good reason. In over 200 years of conquest, they had never lost a single battle. Jake took the datapad and read through the enemy capabilities. The Kethnari possessed energy shields that no known weapon could break through. Their main guns could crack planets in half with a single shot. Their ships moved through space like living things, and their crews fought with the confidence of gods who had never known defeat. 17 star systems had fallen to them, and billions of people now served as slaves in their empire. Lisa pointed to a section of the report that made Jake's stomach drop. The enemy leader was War Master Zethkai, and he had already sent a message to Earth. Humanity had 1 week to surrender completely or face total destruction. There would be no negotiation and no mercy for those who resisted. The Kethnari way was simple and brutal. Submit or die. Captain Danny Walsh appeared on the communication screen from his reconnaissance ship. His vessel had been monitoring the edge of the solar system for months, and what he reported made the situation even worse. The Kethnari fleet was already moving toward Earth at incredible speed. Their ships traveled in perfect formations that seemed to mock everything humans knew about space warfare. The energy readings from their engines were so powerful they interfered with Earth's communication networks from 3 light years away. On Earth below, General Patricia Hayes was coordinating the planet's defenses, but everyone knew the truth. Humanity's entire space fleet had only 89 ships, and most of them were barely 1/10 the size of a single Kethnari vessel. The human ships were fast and well designed, but they would be like throwing stones at giants. The math was simple and terrifying. Earth had no chance of winning this fight. Dr. Stephen Clark worked in his laboratory deep beneath the Defense Command headquarters. He was humanity's best scientist, and he studied every piece of information they had about Kethnari technology. His team had been analyzing alien ship designs for weeks, but they found no weaknesses. The enemy shields adapted to any weapon that hit them. Their hulls were made from materials that human science barely understood. Their weapons used physics that seemed impossible. Jake called an emergency meeting of all senior officers. The conference room filled with the best military minds that humanity could offer, but the mood was grim. Everyone had seen the intelligence reports and everyone knew what they meant. Lisa presented the tactical analysis with cold facts that left no room for hope. The Kethnari fleet would reach Earth in 6 days. Human forces would be destroyed in less than 4 hours of combat. The planet would fall and humanity would become another slave race. General Hayes joined the meeting through a secure link from Earth. Her face appeared on the main screen, and she spoke with the authority of someone who had fought in every major conflict of the last 30 years. The planet's orbital defenses were being prepared, but they would only delay the inevitable. Ground forces were digging in for a resistance that might last months or years, but could never achieve victory. The civilian population was being moved to underground shelters, but there was nowhere to hide from weapons that could destroy continents. Captain Walsh reported that his long-range sensors were detecting more details about the approaching fleet. The Kethnari ships moved with mechanical precision, and their formation never changed. They approached Earth like a force of nature that could not be stopped or reasoned with. Each vessel was a masterpiece of destructive technology, and together they represented the accumulated military might of an empire that spanned dozens of worlds. Dr. Clark appeared on screen from his laboratory, and his news was no better. His analysis of Kethnari technology showed that humanity was facing an enemy that was thousands of years more advanced. Their weapons could destroy matter at the atomic level. Their shields could deflect the energy of entire stars. Their ships were powered by reactors that generated more energy than Earth's sun. Fighting them would be like insects attacking a hurricane. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the reality of their situation. Jake looked around at the faces of his officers and saw fear mixed with determination. These were good people who had dedicated their lives to protecting humanity, but they were facing something beyond their experience. The Kethnari were not just another enemy. They were a force that had conquered most of the galaxy, and they had never been defeated. Lisa spoke up first, and her voice was steady despite the circumstances. She reminded everyone that surrender meant slavery for every human being. The Kethnari did not negotiate or show mercy. They took what they wanted and destroyed anyone who opposed them. Death in battle was better than a life in chains. The other officers nodded in agreement because they all knew she was right. General Hayes added that Earth's population would never accept surrender anyway. Humans had fought for freedom throughout their history, and they would not stop now. The planet was preparing for invasion, and every city was organizing resistance groups. Even if the space battle was lost, the war would continue on the ground. Humanity might fall, but they would make the Kethnari pay for every inch of Earth they took. Jake stood up and looked at each person in the room. His decision would affect the future of the human race, and he knew that history would judge him for what happened next. The smart choice was to negotiate for better terms of surrender. The logical choice was to save as many lives as possible. But Jake Morrison was a soldier, and he understood something that logic could not measure. Some things were worth fighting for even when victory was impossible. He spoke in a voice that carried throughout the ship, and his words would be remembered long after the battle was over. Humanity might not be able to win against the Kethnari fleet, but they could show the galaxy what it cost to conquer Earth. They would fight with everything they had and prove that humans would never bow to any master. The price of freedom was always paid in blood, and humanity was ready to pay it.